Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. Tonight on the programme we'll be discussing the ongoing clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem. We'll also be looking at a move by the US to halt release of footage showing Guantanamo inmates being force-fed. But first, our lead story. The Kurdish armed group, the YPG, say they're taking ground in the besieged town of Kobane. US airstrikes are intensified and the Pentagon has confirmed that Islamic State fighters have been hit. Yasmin Khatun has more.
US-led airstrikes have killed several hundred Islamic State fighters around the Syrian town of Kobane. It is thought that at least 20 of these fighters are British. This comes as the United States and its allies have dramatically stepped up airstrikes in the past 2 days. The US-led coalition launched at least 50 airstrikes on the mainly Kurdish town, the largest number since the strikes inside Syria began. Kurdish officials said the main Kurdish armed group, the YPG, have given Americans target coordinates to try and halt the Islamic State assault, though the Pentagon has declined to confirm any coordination with the group. The mainly Kurdish town on the border with Turkey has become a focus for the US-led effort to halt the group, who claim to have established a caliphate across swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq. The coalition has been bombing Islamic State targets in Iraq since August and extended the campaign to Syria in September. After weeks in which Kobane was rarely targeted, the town has now become the main focus of strikes. It was thought before the assault last night, Islamic State had seized more than a third of the Syrian border town. Speaking this morning, US Special Envoy General John Allen said the US is hitting targets around Kobane for humanitarian purposes.
We're actually focusing, obviously, around Kobane, providing airstrikes to provide humanitarian assistance and relief there, obviously, to give some time to the fighters to organize on the ground. But in the Anbar province, our hope is to stop or halt that tactical initiative and momentum that they have there.
Yasmin Khatun, The Report.
Well, joining me in the studio to discuss this is Dr Rebwar Fatah, who's director at the think tank Middle East Consultancies. And on Skype, we're joined by Akbar Shahid Ahmed, who's a reporter from the Huffington Post, and he's joining us from Washington. Welcome to the programme, both of us. So there's over 30 days of the siege of Kobane, and it's only in, the last 5 or so that the US has been targeting it with the airstrikes. Why do you think the change of policy came?
I think Kobane has become the symbol. I think somebody said become a symbol of resistance against Islamic State. And I believe somebody said it's like Leningrad. If Kobane fails, it really will be a moral boost for the Islamic State. So I know it's a small place, Kobane, but it's a nail in the coffin because Islamic State is controlling vast areas and that area stayed outside of their control. So they want to occupy it and probably have a better access to bringing insurgents around the world into Syria without the world knowing about it.
Akbar, do you think that's true? Because, I mean, there were figures being released around the social media, figures coming from CENTCOM, from the American Command Center, saying that out of 300 strikes in Syria and Iraq, previously only about a dozen had been in Kobane. Do you think they were embarrassed into this?
I don't think it's a sense of embarrassment. I think it's a growing awareness in DC on the strategic importance of Kobane. And you can see that really in how the rhetoric shifts. You saw last week the State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki and Secretary of State John Kerry making statements that essentially said Kobane was not necessarily in the strategic interest of the US coalition. What you've seen now, I think, is a couple of things. The first is the recognition that the US can, to some extent, potentially work with the Syrian Kurds, the YPG fighters mentioned. And you see that with the increasing number of strikes. They wouldn't have been striking at these positions did they not trust the military coordinates the YPG was providing. And especially given the complicated regional politics there, with Turkey being a US ally, not being necessarily aligned with the Syrian Kurds, for the US to say, we'll take the coordinates from the Syrian Kurds and strike in those positions, that's a big step. The other thing is just the slowness of the process in Washington. It can take time for things to go really from intelligence to operational. And the final thing I just emphasize to you is the role of the Free Syrian Army. I think this is really underreported. There are between 300 and about 1,500 rebel fighters who are Sunni or Shia from other communities who are not Kurdish with the non-jihadist rebels who the US is meant to partner with. They're in Kobane as well. So Kobane is not just a barometer for Syrian Kurds. It's a barometer for the entire US-backed kind of rebel coalition within Syria.
What do you make of the, Akbar's raising there the question of Turkey? The Turkish tanks, as we've all seen, are lined up on the other side of the border, not doing very much except watching. Is this the increased airstrikes? Is this a kind of rebuke to Turkey by the United States?
I believe I think there's a Turkish element into American stepping up the bombing of Kobane. I believe somehow Turkey managed or delayed its participation in the coalition and denouncing ISIS and the rest of it. And I believe America now taking the Kobane issue into its own hand, probably making a political statement saying that despite the Turkish unwillingness to help, we can still do this on our own. Because, I mean, the bombing is tremendous. In the last couple of days, there was over 30 strikes over Kobane. And Kobane is a small town. It's not really, Stalingrad, if you like. It's just a small town. I believe in looking behind the scenes, I think Americans are very dissatisfied with the Turkish involvement in all this.
And by extension, Akbar, it won't be happy news in Ankara if the Kurds emerge as the heroes of Kobane, will it?
Right. I mean, it's difficult because the US is definitely expressing a lot of displeasure, and you're hearing that in back channels in Washington. There's a lot of sort of surprise that Turkey doesn't see the long-term benefit of maintaining some Syrian Kurdish presence against ISIS. I think the Turks in Ankara definitely do not want to see the Syrian Kurds get stronger. And the argument here in Washington is that's an extremely short-termist policy. For Turkey, the question is, would they rather have a strong Syrian Kurdish buffer between what may be the rest of ISIS in those regions of Syria? They're talking about having a kind of buffer zone. The Syrian Kurds don't want that. And the Turks and the Syrian Kurds have been in conversations. The leader of Syrian Kurds was in Ankara about talking to them, and the kind of conditions the Turks are setting down for any assistance with them just aren't acceptable.
Well, that's because, isn't that because, viewed from where the Kurds are, your buffer zone looks like an invasion of our Kurdistan? It's that, and it's a sense that the Syrian Kurds don't want to be operationalized just for Turkey, right? They have a strong sense of pride in having these cantons, whether it's Kobane or the other bigger canton, Jazeera, which people aren't really focusing on right now. But the Syrian Kurds, I think, are seeing this as a big step for their fighters. And they don't want a Turkish ownership of that, Turkish control of that. And then you look at Turkey bombing the PKK within its own borders. And you have a very volatile situation because the Turkish people as a whole generally still aren't necessarily friendly towards the Kurds, right? So it's difficult to also mobilize public will within Turkey. And that's something the Syrian Kurds, I think, are having trouble understanding. But to just sort of widen the frame a bit from the discussion of what's happening in Kobane, in other areas, the bombing doesn't seem to be perceived as legitimate because it seems to be, say, in Iraq, pushing the Sunni and ISIS together. It's been hitting civilians. It's much more contested elsewhere, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's the situation of Iraq and Kobane is really totally different because the Kobane is people defending their own town, while in Sunni regions, I still have to say, sadly, that the central authority, the Shia-dominated government, seen as invader. I believe the bombing would not have an effect because still a huge part of the population supporting Islamic State, we like it or not. Because if they have, what's the choice? Having a Shia control or having a fundamental Sunni control? And I'm afraid people normally thinks much smaller, not in a longer term for their own benefit. I believe if there is a political package which goes with the bombing, you cannot convince the Sunnis. What do they get out of this? well, if they stay, they will be. If they don't let Shia government to control them, they will have Sunni control, fundamental Sunni control. If they allow the Shias to come in, they will have Shia control over Sunni, which they have experienced in the past. It wasn't very pleasant. So unless there is a political package for Sunnis in those regions, for example, saying, we develop some sort of local democracy, and you can, for example, I don't know, dividing Iraq into 18 federal states, and you say you run your own affairs. I'm afraid this battle will be going on for many, many months to come, if not years. So it's a political issue. You cannot really solve, you cannot bomb a political problem. This is the main issue.
Akbar, do you agree with that the bombing is not effective, quite possibly counterproductive in Iraq?
I think that you raise a very good point in terms of it's a matter of winning over people's support, right? And convincing the Iraqi Sunnis that there is something to be gained for them in not joining ISIS, in getting some kind of buy-in for the Shiite government. I think the biggest issue for them right now is it's the political package that Dr. Fatah mentioned, but it's also military. I think the US has to show a leadership role in terms of reconstructing the Iraqi security forces, which had become a very kind of sectarian force. We've now heard reports in DC of the US working with coalition partners, trying to get training for the Iraqi security forces. I think that's critical. You're hearing about a kind of step 2 of the Sunni awakening in Iraq, which happened during the end of the Iraq War there. That's important, to win over the Sunni tribes, not just politically, but also to say, you are part of the fight, you can be part of the Iraqi security forces, we'll engage you there.
Akbar, do you think that's possible, though? I mean, people keep saying this. This is sort of part of the American wish list. But I mean, this is round 2 with this. Didn't come off well in the first case. Doesn't look like it's actually happening. Is it anything more than something people are wishing for?
I think I don't want to speculate on whether or not it's completely feasible. I think what I would say is that the government in Iraq is the key factor here, right? Because it's about how much of an influence the U.S. government can have on Haider al-Abadi and his ministers to make this a reality. And I think in Iraq, the U.S. actually has a stronger hand than they do in, say, Syria, where they've got a lot of confusion over the rebels having different goals from them. In Iraq, the U.S. and Haider al-Abadi's government essentially have a very similar long-term goal, which is the stability of the Iraqi state. I think they're more likely to have influence with that government in terms of pushing them to get these changes. But again, as you mentioned, this is a Shia-led government. This is a government which includes elements of Nouri al-Maliki's, political elite.
I mean, it sounds like from that description, it sounds like Syria, there's nobody helping us on the ground except people that we'd rather not end up supporting, like the Kurds. And in Iraq, well, we've got a government, but it's pretty useless.
I mean, the government. There's no doubt that the government pretty useless. The government failed to rule the country. The government actually, you have a government in Baghdad asking the West for help, and then in their own media attacking the West. They call them invaders and the rest of it, and they can't do it themselves. It's totally useless, and that's not. This is the main problem. For example, people like Maliki. Maliki should have been behind bars, and now he is the deputy president of Iraq. How did that happen? And that doesn't really help the situation on the ground. The government, Iraq, throughout the history, Iraq always ruled by one sect. And everybody's familiar with the tricks that sect can do. For example, under Saddam Hussein, the deputy president of Iraq was a Kurd. But what did it mean? Nothing. And there was many Kurds in the high positions. Unless you demolish this structure and start again, that everybody genuinely taking part, and I don't see how you do that in Baghdad. You really have to develop some sort of local democracy, that people run their own affairs in their local governance.
OK, well, thank you both, gentlemen. It looks as if that's a situation that may get worse before it gets better. But that's all we've got time for. But now we're going to take a look at some more of today's news. Negotiations in